certainly allowed to do that. The question is whether or not, the order is important. Like if the board of trustees or the community or, make it clear that they have the intention of, replacing the shul, is that good enough? Or do you actually need the new building to be constructed, before you begin the dismantling process? Okay, that's the issue. So the Gemara says, "Lo istra inish bnei knishla de bani be knishla achriti," and then the Gemara says, "Ika da amri mishum pshiusa, v'ika da amri mishum tzluye." That there are two views. One view is that this is based on the factor of pshiusa. Rashi says, "What is pshiusa? Dilma misrami ones upashi v'labanu achriti." Sorry. That maybe something will happen unforeseen. In other words, you thought that everything would be smooth sailing. You'd raise the money, or maybe you even have the money. We'll get to that a little bit later. And then unforeseen, some, bump on the road emerges. There's some other monetary pressure, or you were counting on, the participation or the contribution of somebody or a group of people, and all of a sudden they're not capable of contributing, whatever it is. So we're worried the best laid plans, that even though you have a clear goal to replace the shul, which would make its dismantling acceptable, that something will come about to disrupt those plans. And once those plans are disrupted, you won't either see, the replacement, or it'll be very delayed, and that would be a problem. Okay.
Is that the problem, or is the problem that there's nowhere to go in between? Do we care that? Meaning, is there a logic that once you build it, so then people from shul go from place A to place B, and if you dismantle it, then you've really lost the shul because there's nowhere for the shul to go to.
Well, that's the next line.
That's permanent.
That's the second line of the Gemara. The first view is Mishum Piusa. That's what we just said. The second view is Ika da Amri Mishum Tzeluye. Mishum Tzeluye means that the people don't have a place to daven in the interim. But they're not so worried about what you said. You're speaking from the vantage point of, you're worried about the long-term membership or commitment to the shul, which is a great perspective. But the Gemara seemingly is interested in a more, pragmatic point, and that is like, where are you going to daven in the interim? You can't just close down a shul and leave the people high and dry, even if you're not worried about long term, even in the short term, right? So that's what Mishum Tzeluye means. Mishum Tzeluye means we're worried about tefillah. Where are people going to daven in the meantime? Oh, it sounds like these are very different reasons, and we'll have to see how different they are really in both directions. Mishum Tzeluye, as I say, sounds like there's a practical problem, and it's an interim problem, and it's a very understandable problem. Namely, you're not going to shut down the shul if you don't have a place to daven, for the community. It sounds like the problem of pshiusa, and we'll see this in a moment, has something more to do with like a broader perspective on the role of a community shul, and kind of not degrading like the profile of a shul in the community, or shul presence, or the tzibur's tefillah presence in the community. So we'll see if this is true or not. The Gemara says, "My benayu." What's the difference between these two perspectives? The perspective of pshiusa, we're worried that you won't, end up building the replacement shul, or at least not in a timely fashion, and the concern of Sluya, you won't have a place to daven. My benayu, what's the difference? Says the Gemara, Ika benayu de Ika be knishta. I'm going to read this girsa. Achriti. There's another shul. Let's say there are two shuls in the community. So if there's another shul, there's a place to daven in the interim. However, you previously had two shuls in the community. Now you're going to end up with only one shul. So that's apparently, if you have this girsa, that's still a problem from the perspective of pshiusa. In terms of Saluye, it solves the problem. That's one girsa. If you look at the Masoret Hashas, there's another girsa here. We'll see the Rishonim have these two girsos. And that is my benayu, ike benayu, not the ike beknishtachriti, but the ike duchtel, which means you have another place to daven. What's the difference between a Beis HaKnesses, another Beis HaKnesses, and a place to daven? The difference is, let's say you have a temporary or ad hoc or informal place to daven, but it's not a shul. A shul is not only a place to daven. A shul is a community center, which has kedushas Beis HaKnesses, has sanctity, which is why there are things you're not allowed to do in a shul. You're not allowed to conduct yourself in a manner that is, too casual or flippant. You're not supposed to eat in a shul. You're not supposed to drink in a shul. You're not supposed to sleep in a shul. There are other things that you're not supposed to do in a shul. A shul has kedushas Beis HaKnesses. A shul is what's known, according to the Gemara in Megillah, as a mikdash ma'at. It's like a mini Beis HaMikdash. So let's say you have another place to daven, but it's not a shul. So that is a very interesting question. According to this other girsa, the Manda Amar says Mishum Tzeluye is only concerned that you have a place for Tefillah B'tzibur. And that's what the word Tzeluye seems to mean, Tefillah. Whereas the other Manda Amar, right, Mishum Pshiusa, is worried about Kedushas Beis HaKnesses. So what would be, according to the Manda Amar, Mishum Pshiusa, according to this girsa, if you had another Beis HaKnesses? Does it matter that you are potentially going down from two shuls in the community to one? Or we don't care as long as there's a Beis HaKnesses? Our real concern is that we shouldn't lose the integrity of Chefsa Shel Beis HaKnesses. So we'll see in a moment.
Just simply, if you're merging two shuls, are you allowed to rip down a shul? You're not replacing it.
Right. So that's very much dependent on what we're talking about here.
That's
now, again, if the
that's what I'm asking. I'm sorry.
There could be other factors which we'll get to in a moment. The question is, what is the range of what's called tiyuha, cracks or an objective reason, to dismantle, a shul. But the Mandamar who says, put it this way, the Mandamar says Mishum Tzluye seems to be satisfied as long as there is at least a makom tefillah b'tzibur, or at the most a tefillah b'tzibur in the context of a Beis HaKnesses. And therefore, there would be no problem, probably according to him, of merging two shuls into one, even if you're not going to build this, back the second one. However, the Mandamar Mishum Pshiusa, we'll see this in Rabbeinu Yonah in just a minute. Mandamar Mishum Pshiusa may have a problem if you reduce the number of shuls in a community, all things being equal, because that kind of downgrades the profile of Beis HaKnesses in the community. There used to be two, now there's one. There used to be three, now there's two. That would be a factor. Now, there are still, as I say, considerations, like let's say you have, a declining population.
The declining membership.
And it's not viable to run both shuls. And if you're trying to run both shuls, then both of them will go under. Right. That might be the equivalent. That's why this is such an interesting topic. That might be the equivalent of, tiyuha, which we'll get to in a second. So, for example, the Rush says explicitly, if you want to build, let's say you want to take a shul, you want to dismantle it because you want to build a bigger shul. Not your case, where you want to, there were two and you want to, merge them. Let's say there's a shul. Let's say there's one shul, and you want to build it back, bigger to meet, a growth in the community. So we'll see in a moment. The Rosh says that everybody agrees you can do that, even if it means dismantling first. That's not what we're talking about in the sugya. Not everybody agrees. So again, that's really what we're asking. We're asking is, are we concerned just functionally with, having a place, an outlet for tefillah b'tzibur, which is so important? Are we interested in having a kedushas beis hakneses, or are we interested in not declining, with respect to the presence of mikdash ma'at in the community, which means that we don't want, all things being equal, to go down in the number of batei knesios that we have, because it's like a downgrading of the profile of something that's an important symbol in the community. Okay, everybody with me? Good. Let's read one more line, and then we'll see the argument on this point between the Rosh, Tosas, and Rabbeinu Yonah. The Gemara says as follows: Mereimar Mazutra Sasri Abanu Bekitra Besitva Bekaita Besitva Ubanu Besitva Bekaita. So the Gemara says that the Mereimar and Marzutra used to allow the dismantling of the winter shul in the summer and the summer shul in the winter. Rashi, Bekaita B'sitva, Beis HaKnesses Hayalahem, Limos HaChoref, right? They had a winter shul, which was Namuch Biksalim. It had lower walls, right? Rechavim, had wide walls. They were lower, I think. They were lower and wider. The Chalonos Muatin, and they had smaller windows. The Pnei Atzina. I noticed they were concerned about the cold, so it was a heated synagogue, or a synagogue conducive not to not to being overly exposed to the elements. Ubimos Achama, Beis HaKnesses, Acher, Shavir Sholet Bo. They had air conditioning. They had air circulating. Bigger windows, higher walls, something conducive more for, the summertime. So the Gemara says that they would, dismantle one in the winter, and they would get to build the other one, and so on. So the question is this: is that consistent with the Mandamar of Piusa, or is that only consistent with the Mandamar of Tziluye?
Which converts the initial idea that God had for the creation into a product.
I don't know where that's coming from. Someone's got a recording on.
Definitely not from me, I can tell you that.
No, I know. I'm trying to find it. Okay.
So, everybody with me so far? So, Ikadamer Mishum Tzli, Mai Benayu, Ika Benayu, Dika Beknish Tachriti, and then Meremar Marzutra, Sasri Banu, Bekaita Besitva, Banu Besitva Bekaita. Says the Gemara, Amalei Ravina Ravashi. Okay, we'll leave that for now. So look at the Rosh for a minute, and we'll see what the Rosh says. Now, this practice of Marzutra and Beremar, is that only according to the Mandamar Mishum Tzluye, or is it even according to the Mandamar Mishum Piusa? That's the question. So look at the Rosh on page 2 of the Mar Makomos. Not the first entry, but which is Aliyah Rabbeinu Yonah. We'll get back to that. But the Rosh, Masachet Bava Basra, Perek Aleph, Siman Dalet. Very interesting Rosh. The Rosh says, Amrav Chizah lo listar inish be'knishta, elam kein banu be'knishta achriti. That's the Gemara. Ikadam rishum pshusa, ikadam rishum tzluye, my benayu, benayu dikaduchta tzluye. Meremar or Marzutra sasru banu be'kaita besitva be'kaita. Inu savri, they hold mishum tzluye. So the Rosh adds commentary to the Gemara and says that this practice that you can shut down the winter shul in the summer and the summer shul in the winter, that's only according to the Mandamar of Tziluye, because you have an alternative. You have a functioning shul to replace it. But they say, the Rosh says that the halacha is according to the mandamar of pshiusa, meaning the more stringent view that we're worried that that something will happen, something unforeseen will happen, and you won't be able to replace the synagogue that you dismantled, and therefore you can't dismantle until you build. And that is true, says the Rosh, even if you have a working synagogue in the interim. What about the Gemara, which said that in the winter shul, the summer shul? That's a different man Amar. We don't paskin like him. He holds tzluye. We hold pshiusa. That's the view of the Rosh. According to the Rosh, if you hold pshiusa, having even a proper synagogue, in the interim doesn't help you. However, now look at Tosfos. You can either look at Tosfos on the page, Dibra Masal Haggah, Bekaita Ube Sitva, or it's also on the page here on page 1 in the Mar Makomos. For those of you who don't have an actual Gemara in front of you, it is the second entry on page 1. Haggah Bekaita Ube Sitva. Everybody with me? Tosfos was troubled by the same problem. How could they dismantle the winter shul in the summer shul in the winter? If they were worried about a pshia. Says Tosfos, Beikaita ube sitva have kamo ika tiyuha v'shari. Later on, the Gemara says, if we'll read it in a minute, the Gemara says that if there's cracks in the structure, let's say the structure needs to be replaced because there's something wrong with it, it's flawed. You're not choosing to dismantle. You're dismantling because there's tiua, there are cracks in the shul. So the Gemara says everybody agrees in that condition you can dismantle.
So we're talking about, just to be clear, dismantling where there are no cracks, meaning where you're just dismantling something.
Now the question is, what does cracks mean? So here's a big argument. The Ran in Masachet Megillah and others say that cracks means a sakana. We're worried about, the building inspection people came and they said it's not safe to pray here.
Structural.
Right? It's a hazard. Structural flaw. And it's a hazard. Okay, that's simple. That's a davar pashut. If there's something wrong with the shul, and it's structurally unsound, so then clearly you can't wait around until you build a new shul before you dismantle. You got to dismantle it because it's a danger. You don't have the luxury of waiting around. However, what we'll see, and what we're already encountering in Tosfos, is that maybe tiyua, which means cracks, doesn't have to mean a sakana. Maybe all it means is that we're not doing this out of, luxury or aesthetics. There's like an objectively compelling reason to dismantle the shul. I mean, there are some problems with the shul, even if it isn't a sakana. It's not considered a derogation of kedushas or kavod beis hakneses, because there are objectively good reasons to replace it, even if it isn't a danger to anybody. So Tosfos here says that a winter shul in the summer and a summer shul in the winter is the equivalent of ikaba tiyua, meaning it's not sakana. It's just a very understandable reason why it should be replaced. But you can't use it now anyway. No one's going to daven, in the summer shul in the winter, or the winter shul in the summer. It's just not, conducive. It's too cold or it's too hot or whatever. So since it's an objectively good reason, not just a decision or an aesthetic decision, right? So then you're allowed to dismantle the shul. That's the first day of Tosas. Tosas is trying to explain, if we hold pshiusa, so how are they allowed to do this? The answer is the way that we look at a winter shul in the summer shul in the winter is the equivalent of tiyua, because we don't think that tiyua means like the Ram thinks in Megillah, that it's a sakana. We think that tiyua means that, it's not arbitrary. It's not a decision that anybody will question. There are very good reasons not, why this shul is not viable right now. It doesn't have air conditioning. It doesn't have heat, right? Let's continue. Then Tosa says, the im shtei bete knesios heim bebeis mekomos shel kaita v'shel sitva. Let's say it's not a question of replacing it because you need to use it, or in the same place. They can't have both. Then Ira could go into Chazal Beit Tiyua. Maybe we're talking about a situation where they really found a crack in the shul. In the shul that they want to dismantle, they found a crack. Not any crack. I mean, a crack that justifies replacement. Interesting. Then Tosa says the most important thing. The od nira, it also seems that kiven sheyesh sham beis hakneses acher in lachush im lo yivnu zos. Meaning, even if you hold mishum pshiusa, this is the big chiddush. The word, it's not going to happen, that something will come about to distract and it'll never take place. Even if we're worried about that, if there's a working, full, proper Beis HaKnesses, you can dismantle the existing shul. It's only, so what does the Gemara say? There's an afkamina between the two, tzluye and pshiusa, ika beiduchta litzluye. It sounds like the Mandamar says pshiusa, that, he's machmir and thinks even if you have another option, you're still not allowed to dismantle the shul. Says Tosas, there's a difference between the odnira, kiven sheyesh beis hakneses acher ein lachush, im lo yivnu zos, had kamar de ika duchta litzluye, hainu she'ein beis hakneses. That refers to a situation where there's no shul at all. There's only a makom tefillah. Everybody's getting together in somebody's, in the lobby of the apartment building, or in the tent, or in somebody's house. So there is a makom.
Is there a situation? Is there a situation of permanence? In other words, they get together in, as you say, the lobby or whatever, but they do it all the time. So in a way,
but it doesn't have kedushas Beis HaKnesses, and it doesn't have the kiyus of the Beis HaKnesses.
But my question is that there is an element of kvius here, that they daven there all the time. They read from the Torah.
There's a difference between kvius and exclusivity. It's not an exclusive shul. It's a lobby. It's not a shul.
So again, the parameters are not crystal clear. So it is a good question. You're saying, let's say every Friday night, in some communities, this is like a big issue. So it's cold, it's far, it's dark, it's COVID, it's 100 different things. So instead of, they spring up these neighborhood, minyanim in somebody's house, in somebody's backyard, I guess these days in somebody's, when the weather's better, in somebody's tent, right? So they do it on a semi-regular basis, so it's not completely ad hoc. My instinct is that that's still not. I think when we say Beis HaKnesses, we mean something that is kavua, literally. I mean, it was built for this, and it has kedushas Beis HaKnesses. So, for example, as I mentioned before, there are things you're not allowed to eat in the shul, you're not allowed to drink in the shul, you're not allowed to sleep in the shul. We'll get to it in a second. You're not allowed to use the shul as a shortcut, a kapandaria. You're not allowed to use the shul as a place, a refuge for the weather, for the bad weather. If it's raining outside, I'll go into the shul. If you're on your way to shul and it's raining outside, that's fine. But to use the shul as an umbrella, is inappropriate. You could use somebody's house as an umbrella, and even if there's a minyan there, every Friday night, you can still use it as an umbrella, and you can use it as a kapandaria, meaning it's not devoted and dedicated to tefillah. It's not a mikdash ma'at, is what I'm trying to say. Now, what aspect of, Beis HaKnesses are we looking for? Are we looking for the beauty, the aesthetics, the permanence, or are we looking also to the sanctity? My suspicion is it's sanctity, but I'm going to show you a language in Rabbeinu Yonah in just a second, which implies that it's the grandeur or the beauty, of the shul. So it is a very, very good question. Very good question. However, my instinct is that, we're talking about the full, the fullness of a shul. And by the way, I think it's a very interesting issue, right? So if you take that, according to Tosas, if you say that, so then what you're saying is, even if it's mishum pshiusa, which is the more chamor view, you have to wait until you dismantle, until you have something, that is built. But it's not about how many batei knesiyot there are in the community. It's about not having a situation where there's no formal, full-fledged, fully dedicated Beis HaKnesses. This is a very important theme, because I think we live in a time, again, with all the things going on, the pressures and counter pressures, whether it's just, distance or, crises, or just, the usual Jewish, politics, in communities. Like, a lot of people look at a shul like in a very functional way. Oh, it's a place to daven. We can do it we can switch off, and do it in our homes or in our backyards. And sometimes you need to do that. During COVID and other things, for sure, there were times that was very appropriate and very necessary. And there are other times when you do it as well. A Beis Avel, things like that. That's because the whole point is to stay in your home and not to go out. But the bigger point I'm trying to make is that, people are not necessarily sensitive to the fact that a shul is a mikdash ma'at, and it has sanctity. The limitations of things you can do in it indicate its special status. And there is a certain, undefined, but still very, very powerful quality, to understanding that the shul is more than simply the things that you do in it. It's a community institution, that it's intended to galvanize the community, to inspire the community, to reflect the community, as we'll discuss. And is more than the sum of its parts and has sanctity and has to be treated in a certain way. It's a mikdash ma'at. Therefore, even the functional things that it does, potentially, are qualitatively different. Let me say it this way. According to Tosas, when the Gemara says tsuluye, right? Ikeduchta, put it this way: there emerges between the Rush and Bali Tosas an argument where, when the Gemara said the nafkamina is duchta litzluye, does that mean a shul, or does that mean, a
That's makom tefillah.
Makom tefillah, temporary, arai, not kavua. So the word sluye, technically just means tefillah. So if we say that what the Gemara was saying was the nafkamina is duchta litzluye, and it means any place where you can have a minyan, then the word tsluya, which means tefillah, makes a lot of sense. But if, like the Rush understood, it's not just, makom tefillah, it's makom beis haknesses, right? So what we're really saying is, and if there was not another Beis HaKnesses, even the Mandamar Tzuluye would not be happy. Meaning, but there'll be Tefillah B'tzibur. You'll have it in the lobby or out in the tent or in the neighbor's yard. So apparently, then the word Tzluye takes on like a different meaning. It refers to the quality of the tefillah. I mean, the problem is there won't be tzluya. It doesn't mean you won't be able to have a minyan b'tzibur. It means you won't be able to have, a quality minyan in a place which is dedicated, and which has kedusha and permanence, and which is built and which serves the community's needs for that purpose. That's called litzluye, according to this view. Because if you hold like the Rosh, right? Assuming you take it that way, then litzluye is not functional completely. It's also qualitative. And it refers to Beis HaKnesses. So all this should be this idea of, you don't take a risk with the Beis HaKnesses, mishum pshiusa, that having a makom of tefillah b'tzibur alone isn't good enough, maybe for anybody, but certainly not for one man to Amar. All this really highlights that a shul functions, a shul is more than functional. A shul is like a necessary, it's more than the sum of its parts. It's kind of a transcendent institution of the community. And I'll explain a little more what I think is going on in a minute. But going even further, let's continue in the Gemara. Oh, before I do, so let me just look at Rabbi Yonah, who I think summarizes these two views, but instead of ascribing the significance of Beis HaKnesses to Kedushas Beis HaKnesses, refers to the aesthetic or the permanence of it. So look at Rabbi Yonah for a minute. That's in the beginning of page 2. Rabbi Yonah says on top of page 2, everybody have it? Lo lista inish beknishta adabani beknishta achriti. Okay, you can't dismantle the shul until you build its replacement. If whether it's mishum pshus or mishum tzluye, the nafkamina is right if you have another place to daven. Pirish, listen to what he says. Kigon sheyichdu bayis lihispalo bo ad sheyivnu beis haknesses. This is exactly what I was talking about for the Rosh, but he just spells it out much more clearly. Meaning, duchta litzluye sounds like pragmatic, just a place to daven, a place to hang your hat, or your a place to be able to say kedusha and kriyas haTorah and so on, chazaras hashatz and so on. Right? Says the Rabbeinu Yonah, at least the first pshat, no. Kigon sheyichtu bayis lihispalo ad sheyivnu beis haknesses. It refers to a real shul. Demishum tzluye leika, right? There's no problem of tzluye if you have another Beis HaKnesses, but there's still a problem mishum pshiusa ika, because there used to be 2 shuls. Now there's only going to be 1 shul. She'ein bayezeh, right? Hidru lebeis HaKnesses kavua karishon. The Yeshiv Farshim, that's the problem of mishum. The Yeshiv Farshim, the Ikabeg Knishta Litzluye, or no, maybe even if there's another Beis HaKnesses, Afilu Hachim Mishum Pshiusa Ika, why? The Kim Sheisham Shnei Bate Knesiyos, Ein Lifshoa Biachad Behen. Going down in the profile, in the presence of Bate Knesiyos in a community, that's a problem. Ulefizelo Kaimelan Kimreimar Umar Zetra, Debana by Kita Besitva, the Ikelemechers of Pshiusa. Afagav Dika B'Knishta Akriti. Okay? So is having a Makom Tefillah, which isn't a shul, good enough for the Mandamar Mishim Tzluye? That's one question. And is having a real Beis HaKnesses, in the community, enough for the Mandamar Mishim Pshiusa? That's in the other direction. These are the 2 points of argument. in both of them, what emerges like very interesting perspectives on the role of a community synagogue. Okay, let's continue. So the Gemara says, Omale Ravina Ravashi, Gavuzuze Umachti Mai. Let's say the people collected money, meaning the fundraising campaign was successful. And
there is money.
All the money in the bank.
Yeah.
So can you start dismantling the old shul since you have the means to build the new one? Says the Gemara, Amarle Dilma Misramalu Pigeon Shvuyim V'Yavalu.
Right, we talked about this last week. Pigeon shvuim could come up and you have to give the money away.
So let me ask you this: how often does Pigeon Shvuyim come up?
Very not often, but it could come up. Well, let's say it's 10 years, once 100. What's the difference?
I'm saying, so you're not going to allow, the progress, on the shul because of something that happens once in 100 years, or once in 10 years. The question is this: is there a real concern, mishum pshiusa, or mishum pshiusa is a perspective? Meaning you can't chance it no matter what. It's considered to be, and this goes to the question that I raised before, and that is as following. What are these factors? What is the problem of mishum pshiusa? Is it really a chashash that this won't take place, it won't happen? Or is it an absence of kedushas beis hakneses to risk it? Meaning, it goes to what I asked in the beginning of the year, which is, you have an old shul, you want to build a new shul. How do you look at this? Do you look at it as, well, you need a heter to dismantle a shul, right? Or you're not dismantling the shul, you're improving it, or you're replacing it. Is this stiras beis hakneses, or is this binyan beis hakneses chadash? Right? That's a legal subtle question. For example, I'll give you a simple example.
Why do you have to come on
and frame the question? Just 1 second. I'll give you a way to frame the question. In Hilchos Shabbos, right, soser, melacha soser, tearing down something is a melacha, but it's a melachas mekalkel, right? Because it's a destructive act. Soser manas livnos, if you tear something down or you demolish it with the intention of building in its place or building, right? Soser manas livnos, that's tikkun. That's not mekalkel, that's metakein, and you're chayav for that. So there are two ways to understand that. And that is, when you're soser al manas l'takein, that's a demolition, that's a positive demolition. So the soser is this, there's a case of soser, which is metakein. Or no, that's not what's really happening. What's really happening, when you have soser al manas livnos, the soser is considered tchilas binyan. Soser, as long as something is perceived as soser, it's always mekalkel. But, right, it's a way to look at what's really happening is you're not A, dismantling, B, building something else, right? The dismantling is stage one of building or rebuilding even, right? In which case, you don't have to, that's what Jacob asked me in the beginning of this year, like a little bit, like you're allowed to take apart a shul, even if you're building another one, even, if you build the other one first, but how can you dismantle this? The answer may very well be, the real question is maybe not allowed to dismantle a shul per se. Maybe that's the pshat in the Gemara. But it's not considered dismantling if it's stage one of replacing, or what you're really doing is building. You can say, oh, it's a matter of semantics, but it's not. It's a legal question. The more you can build a shul, if the way to build a shul, is to clear the old shul off the site, maybe that's called binyan, or that's called, as I say, rebuilding. So the Rush, for example, says, if you look at the Rush for another second, the last line, the chen kol binyan shiaf shalav nosa below stira kegon laharchiv v'sabinyan. The Gemara says when you find a crack, everybody agrees you can do whatever you want. Right? So we said before, some people say when you find a crack, that's a sakana. So then you can do whatever you want. Sakanas nefashos. Or no, that's not what crack is. When you find a crack, so we don't say, oh, you're gratuitously, destroying the old shul. You're building a new one, but you're destroying the old one. No. You found a crack. Everybody understands that there's, buildings age, and sometimes you need to fix them. And sometimes the way that you fix them is that you replace them. So even if it's not a sakana, there's an objective reason. It's not like, oh, I'm getting rid of one shul, but I am building another one. Then you still have a problem to justify the getting rid of the first one or the going down in profile. But if there's a tiyuha, even if there's no sakana, so instead of seeing this as, stiras beis hakneses, we should look at it as binyan beis hakneses. So that's what the Rosh is saying. Kol binyan she'ef shalav nosa below stira. Right? If the Fifth Avenue Synagogue, is building in the same place, of the old shul, and it's ef shalav nosa below stira, right? Laharchiv v'sabinyan. That's different than if you're just knocking down a shul, even if you happen to be building another one, but in another place. It's not considered rebuilding or expanding. So it's a very, so what does this have to do with Shem Nisrani? I think maybe the same idea. One way to look at the problem of, Shem. Yeah. David, can you hear?
Hello,
David, you hear? I don't hear Rosensweig. Do you?
I can hear you.
Okay, I think Rosensweig's connection's weak. It hasn't happened yet.
He disconnected. He may connect again.
Okay, it hasn't happened yet.
Yeah, no, I'll tell you, I'm looking at the screen.
I can hear both of you, all of you as a third party now.
Hi, Henry.
Evening.
Hi. Where's? Okay.
Can anyone else hear us?
Yeah, I can.
People are on mute.
I can hear you.
Yeah, I thought it was my connection originally, but it looks like it's a Rosensweig.
I think it's clearly Rev Rosensweig's because I think everybody can hear everybody else.
Okay, he'll come back from Mr. Shem.
He's coming back on.
Okay, great.
Okay. Did everybody go off or just me?
No, just you, Rabbi. I thought it was me, but it was you.
Oh,
It was your connection. But you were in the middle, I think, the rush about, you were talking about dismantling a shul while you're replacing it. You were on that time.
So what I'm trying to say is that there's a very nuanced point here, and that is, do we look at this as a justification for dismantling, or do we look at this as, part of the process of building? And what I'm suggesting is that this affects how we look at Shema, Isrami, Pidyon Shvuyim as well. One way to look at it narrowly, which is the way we were looking at it a minute ago, was like, how likely is this to happen? But even if it's remote, it's a remote possibility, it still, is maybe a reason not to, to dismantle prior to building, because you can never tell, right? It's not foolproof. So if it's not foolproof or not sufficiently foolproof, you have the prohibition. But I think there's another way to look at it. And that is that as long as there's even a remote possibility that this will not get rebuilt, even if it's remote, even if we don't really think that that's going to happen, al pidin, legally, it's considered to be a dismantling, not a rebuilding. Meaning each process is discrete until you know with greater confidence, right, that, that one is going to lead to the other. So even if it's a very low possibility that there'll be a Pidyon Shvuyim or a Pidyon Shvuyim that will disrupt the building of the shul, since it could happen legally, we're still involved in dismantling. We're not involved in just purely rebuilding.
Well, why do we have to go on the Pidyon Shvuyim? Isn't a mikvah come before a shul?
Say that again?
Doesn't a mikvah come before a shul? A mikvah, isn't it more important to have a mikvah than to have a shul?
There are all sorts of hierarchies. I'll speak about that also. What about a Sefer Torah? What about what about other things? Here we're not talking about a mikvah. Here we're talking about Pidyon Shvuyim. Well, what about other mitzvos? Why don't you ask? So when it comes to other mitzvos, if you take the simple reading of this Gemara, it would appear that only Pidyon Shvuyim is a reason to raid the bank account, of the rebuilding or the building of the shul. However, if you look at the Rambam in Hilchos Matnos Aniyim, Perek Ches Halacha Yud Aleph, we'll see that the Rambam had a different girsa in our Gemara. So look on page 2. Anshe Ha'ir, everybody have that? Shagavu Mos LeBeis HaKnesses. The people in the community built a provided funds for Beis HaKnesses. Ubalahem Dvar Mitzvah. And then all of a sudden, they are, confronted with a Dvar Mitzvah. Motzi and Boamos. They can take the money and spend it on a Dvar Mitzvah. Does the Rambam say only Pidyon Shvuyim?
No.
No. He obviously, as the Nosa Kalim pointed out, had a different girsa in the Gemara. If you look at Rabbeinu Yonah, look on top of the page. Rabbeinu Yonah doesn't have a different girsa, but he thinks that the difference is more, community practice, what people tend to do, than a legal distinction. Look at Rabbeinu Yonah, the middle paragraph. Dilma Misrama Pidyon Shvuyim, Afagav Delo Avidi Inshi Luzbune Milsa de Mitzvah Kagon Tzedakah. Even though when it comes to something like tzedakah, people will typically not, they will not take the money, for something like a Beis HaKnesses and then use it for tzedakah. It sounds like they could, like the Rambam holds, but they are not likely to, and that's why the Gemara has the other girsa. Achar sheyesh hachana kol kach dekrevi kishuri ushrigi livni el torchanei mamaxir mekayim mitzvah mimakom acher u'mekamakal Pidyon Shvuyim di mitzvah rabba tvei v'davar nachutz mizabni lehu shein drachim la'acher ad sheyigvu mos. Okay, so there basically are three shitos about if you have funds for the building of a shul, can you divert it, for other things? The simple pshat in the Gemara is only pidyon shvuyim. The Rambam's girsa is pidyon, if it's only money, pidyon shvuyim or any other mitzvah. And Rabbi Yonah says in practice it's pidyon shvuyim. In theory, it could have been other mitzvahs, but that's not what people do. What about the next line of the Gemara? Says the Gemara, keep going. The Gemara says, what happens if you didn't just collect the money, but you already started acquiring the materials that are going to be used in the binyan? For example, right? Shrigi livni, the hudri, right? Umachti kshuri, mai. Says Rashi, to explain what that is. Shrigi livni, misudarim halavenim, zal gabezeh, umizamanim lasisan bebinyan. You already stacked up the bricks, one on top of the other. And not only that, but
you really spent money already on that.
Meshupin umitukanim rehite hagag. You already have been polishing and measuring, the furniture for the gag, etc. What about that? Can you then, are you at an advanced enough stage that at that point you can dismantle the existing shul without worrying about pshiusa? Says the Gemara, Amalei zimnin de misrami pidyon shvuyim. We're still worried about pidyon shvuyim. Right? Nizam neviyayiv, because if it's pidyon shvuyim, you should sell the materials, right, in order to raise money for pidyon shvuyim. Here, the Rambam, if you look back to the Rambam for a minute, Halacha Yud Aleph, the Rambam says, even though they already bought the material, the stones, the godrum, and they measured them, right? Vesakoros upaslum, where they chiseled them. V'yitkinu akol binyan, mochen akol pidyon shvuyim bilvad. Okay. Avalim banu v'gamru lo yimkeru es beis hakneses el yigvu lepidyonim min hatzipor. Even though the Rambam says when it comes to the money, you could use it for any mitzvah if you need to. The Rambam says when you've already bought the materials, it's too late. When you already bought the materials, the only thing that you can sell them for is pidyon shvuyim. All right, let's say you go.
We have really a machlokas here between the Rambam and Rav Ashi, who really speaks only about pidyon shvuyim, not other matters.
Well, yeah, but when it comes to the actual materials, they both agree only for pidyon shvuyim. It's only if it's the money that's where you have the argument.
So they should do the material to get the money to do the pidyon shvuyim.
You would sell the materials.
The materials, yeah.
Yeah, like you put it up on auction or whatever it is.
eBay, yeah.
And you raise eBay and you raise the money. Yeah. Says the Gemara, "Ihachi afilu banu nami." Says the Gemara. So what are you going to say? Let's say they built this spanking new Beis HaKnesses, and now you have a pidyon shvuyim. Are you going to sell the shul for pidyon shvuyim? Says the Gemara, "Amarle dirase de inchi lo mizbidi." People don't sell their homes even for pidyon shvuyim. Very interesting. What does that mean? So we'll see probably next week more fully, but I'll just tell you right now, the Taz in Yoredeya was very hypersensitive to this language. He said, what do you mean? What's the Gemara talking about? Why does the Gemara say, why don't they just say you don't have to sell a shul for pidyon shvuyim? Why do they need to say people don't sell their houses for pidyon shvuyim? So the Taz came up with a very big chiddush, a very interesting idea. The Taz says, you know what? All things being equal, maybe it would be justified to sell a shul, if you needed for pidyon shvuyim.
Almost finished.
Very fascinating question. Like, what are you going to sacrifice community structures for the, for a pressing but an urgent, need? So the Taz says what the Rambam mean, what the Gemara probably means is that in theory, like if you were just measuring the, the weight, the axiology, the value, let's say, of Beis HaKnesses versus the value of Pidyon Shvuyim, there would be a justification to sell the shul even once it's built for Pidyon Shvuyim. However, says the Taz, what the Gemara meant was people are not going to sell their own homes. Somebody just built a home. He's not going to sell it to raise money for Pidyon Shvuyim of the community. I don't know about his own Pidyon Shvuyim, or his family's, but says the Taz, once that's true, that changed the halacha. Meaning, it would be a chil Hashem, and it would be a chilul of kedushas Beis HaKnesses for people who are unwilling to sell their own homes for the cause, to be willing to sell the shul for the cause. Because what are they declaring? That the shul is worth
less valuable than their home.
Is right, exactly. It's more subject to sacrifice than their own homes. That's an enormous skiddush of the Taz. I'll try to bring it in for next week. But Taz says that's why the Gemara used this language. I have a different suggestion, based on the Taz's sensitivity, but a different wrinkle on the whole thing. And that is, I think what the Gemara is telling us is that from a certain point of view, maybe the Beis HaKnesses could be sold for Pidyon Shvuyim, because Pidyon Shvuyim is a very dire situation. We'll talk about that more next week. However, people don't sell their homes for Pidyon Shvuyim. In other words, the shul, in addition to its sanctity per se and its function per se, right, is not less than a home. I don't mean in the same sense that Taz meant it. What I mean is,
but no one's saying
go
go sell a shul for Pidyon Shvuyim. We're saying if the money is there,
no
one's
we're
ever
talking about
sell the shul.
no. That was the previous two Gemaras.
We're saying if you have money in the bank,
No,
you're worried that you might use the money for Pidyon Shvuyim. No one said you're going to sell
we're
a
not saying
shul.
that. That was what we were saying 2 lines ago.
Correct.
Since then, we said, and what happens if you bought the material? Can you sell the material? And the answer was yes. And now what we're talking about is, and let's say you already built the shul. Will you actually sell the shul? Right? This is the line of the Gemara. Go back to the Gemara. The Gemara says, even if they actually built the shul, Amalei, Tirasa de Inchi, Lo Mizabani. The Gemara says, if you already built the shul, Tosa says, if you look at Tosis here, Tosa says, and they already davened in it. Ihachi kibanya nami, pirish ad she yispaluba. Before they davened in it. Let's say they built the shul, they didn't daven in it yet. It might be an issue of Hazmana Milso, or what's called. Till the first time you actually break something in and use it. Anyways, that aside for the moment. So we're not talking about the money, and we're not talking about the materials. We were talking about the money that, according to the Rambam, even for mitzvah you would use. You would divert. The materials only for Pidyon Shvuyim. What about actually building the shul itself? So the Gemara says, no, you wouldn't sell your house. You wouldn't sell a shul. So the Taz says, really, in theory, you would sell the shul. But since you wouldn't sell your house, you can't sell the shul because then you're treating the shul as if it's less than your house. I want to say a different idea. I'm inspired by the Taz. I'm just applying it in a very different direction. I'm inspired by the Taz, and therefore I think the diuk in the Gemara is correct. It's interesting that the Gemara says that the reason that you wouldn't sell the shul is because you wouldn't sell your home. But instead of saying, oh, you won't sell your home, therefore selling the shul is impossible because that shows it's less than your home. What I would say is you don't sell your home because a home is also a core part of, your identity and who you are, and as much as Pidyon Shvuyim is a critical, requirement, especially for other members of the community, but the integrity of your home, and the security of its being safeguarded, and the role that it plays is important too. So maybe what the Gemara is saying is a shul is a home for the community. You know what I'm saying? Instead of looking at it as, just a place to daven or a place to hear a shiur. By the way, because it's the best place to daven and because a beis medrash is a good place to learn, and I don't think these are unrelated either, but I think it's a very profound idea here, and that is that the shul, right, is a home for the community. And you wouldn't sell your home for pigeon shrim, you wouldn't sell the shul.
Didn't the Gemara say that people use now that people used to sleep in the shul? Isn't there a Gemara that says that people
say that again?
People used to sleep in the shul.
No, so this is the next line. This is the next line of the Gemara. The Gemara says, so we'll finish the Gemara for a moment. The Gemara says, this whole principle that you can't dismantle a shul, is only if there are no cracks or structural flaws, or maybe has a wider meaning, as we discussed. If it isn't objectively compelling that you need to replace it, then you can be soser before your bona, right? Kihad Ravashi. So the Gemara, this is what you're referring to, just like the story of Ravashi, that he found a structural flaw in the shul, right? Demata Mechasya, big city in Babel. Sasrei, so he issued an order that they should take down the shul. The ayil lepuria lahasam, and then he brought his bed into the the construction site. And he told them, I'm going to sleep here until the work is completed. He wanted to spur them on. They had kavod for him, so they're going to work, without delay, energetically, right? He said, until we finish completely, like even the gutters and leaders are fixed, I'm sleeping here. So the Rishonim, if you look at Tosas says, Aya Lepuria Lahasam Tema. It's the opposite, of what you asked. But it's based on this Gemara. Ha'amris, the Gemara says in Megillah that Bate Knesios Ein Yishenim Behem, Lo Shenas Keva, Velo Shenas Arai. You're not allowed to sleep in a shul. How could he have slept in a shul? You're not allowed to.
But maybe he just fell asleep. Maybe he just fell asleep by mistake.
No. He said he told the people, take my bed
and bring it to the beis medrash, to the shul.
I'm moving in and for the next 4 months until the construction is done, until the gutters and leaders are finished. No, that's not right. So Rashi in Megillah says that there's a difference between Bate Knesios in Bavel and in Eretz Yisrael. And in Bavel, they didn't have that level. They when they built it to begin with, they knew it would be more temporary. That's the idea, right? Because life in Chutz La'aretz is intended to be temporary.
We have a saying, "Asidim Bate Knesios Bagola," to be rebuilt in Eretz Yisrael. Anyhow. Yeah.
Okay, great. But the point is that in Bavel, it's its days are numbered. So even the Tanai, when they built it, Rashi says, is they didn't have full kedushas. In the Taras Mishum de Babel, Havev Amravasi bePerak Maser de Megillah, right? The Bate Knesios Shel Babel al Tanai Hein Asuyos. They were built on condition that you could use them for certain things. You could eat in them, you could drink in them. That's Rashi's view. Pirusha Kuntras Hasam. Nafkamina linyan aditsnan le'el in ochlin ve'in shosin ve'in nichnasim behem b'chama b'nei chama b'kshamim b'nei agishamim. You can't use it as a weather refuge, right? Ubishal babel mutter. The kamar hasam basi hachi ravina v'ravada have a kaima v'shayli shmaitza me'rava. They were talking and learning. They were asking him some shaila. Also zilcha the mitralayut, so it started raining. The ayla the beknishta. So it started raining. They moved the discussion inside. So the Gemara there says, Lo mishum mitra. They didn't go inside because they're using the shul as an umbrella. I mean, a refuge from the rain. Ela mishum de shmaitza boitzilusa. They said, listen, we can't concentrate. We're getting wet. So we're going into the shul so we can concentrate on the learning, not because we want to be dry per se. Okay.
They were concentrating on learning or on
No, he was asked, they were discussing some learning, some topic.
Yeah.
It started pouring. So they went inside the shul. They were defensive about using the shul as an umbrella. They said, we know we're not supposed to use the shul as an umbrella. It's not respectful. If you go into a shul, you should go into a shul, not because you want a refuge from the weather, right?
Yes.
So the Gemara says, no. It's like a little bit splitting hairs, but it's still, it's reasonable. The Gemara says they went into the shul so they could concentrate on the learning. And they could only do that if they were going to be dry. They didn't go there, it's not like they were doing their banking in the street, and then it started raining. So they went inside the shul to do their banking or just to get out of the weather. They were learning, it started raining, they couldn't concentrate. So they went inside the shul to be able to concentrate better. The reason they were concentrating better is because the shul was safeguarding them from the rain. But the point is, this is Tosa's way of rejecting Rashi. Rashi said that in Bavel, there's like an implicit t'nai that you don't have the full Kedushas Beis HaKnesses. So then what do you need this explanation for about the learning, right? V'hashta, halo Beis HaKnesses shel Bavel haya. This was not an Eretz Yisrael shul, it was a Bavel shul. So they could use it as an umbrella, a refuge from the rain, I mean. So it also says, so how was he able to move his bed into the construction site? The Tosa says, no, it wasn't in the sanctuary.
It was next door there, yeah.
Yeah. The makom she'orchen regilan lishon sham b'lechal. This is what we mentioned last week. They used to, the Gemara says in our Psachim, that's why you make kiddush in shul, right? Because they used to be always aniyim, and they used to eat in shul, drink in shul, sleep in shul, but not in the sanctuary, right? They would have quarters for aniyim. Why do they make kiddush in the Beis HaKnesses? For the guests. Ochlu v'shasu, they ate there, they slept there. Beganu, right? Bebei knishta. V'had amar dal t'nai heinasuyin. What does it mean they made it on condition? V'farishri le'inin shem yachravu. No, if it gets destroyed, they could use the makom. Yasu mehen mashi yirtzu levad mikalas rosh. So this is an interesting thing. With this, we'll stop. But this is an interesting question. So Rashi has his approach about Bate Knesios Sheba Bavel, very interesting because of the, in principle, temporary nature. Tosas disagrees. But there are other answers to this question. So one of the answers of the question appears like in the Ravya and Mordechai. They say, if it's Tzorchei Arabim, you can sleep there. And this, of course, was Tzorchei Arabim. You wanted to make sure they built this shul. It's also Tzorchei Beis HaKnesses. That's another answer that's given. The Ran says that. Why do I care about Tzorchei Arabim? So I want to just underscore 2 points quickly. One, for now, the other to expand on a little bit next week. Like, what's this whole pshiyusa business? What's the problem? How many community shuls there are? Like, what's the point of that? So I think that there are 2 ways to look at this. One is that the shul, as we said before, is a community institution. And it's not just functional, it's also functional, but it's not just functional. There's a certain symbolic significance to the very presence of Batei Knesios in a community. Mashal Madavar Domed, just like we say, that, there's a mitzvah lahoshiv Batei dinim b'kol pelach u'pelach b'kol ir v'ir. Right? You should have a standing court, not just, you go to it when you need it, but also, it's present. When Bnei Yaakov, when Yaakov and his children, formally went to Mitzrayim, to Goshen, so Chazal say that Yehuda, preceded them to establish a yeshiva. Right? The Rambam says in Hilchos Matnos Aniyim that, Lo Matzinu, says the Rambam, a community of, like a regular community in Klal Yisrael that doesn't have like a tzedakah institution. Right? So look at the Rambam in Hilchos Tefillah for 1 minute. Perik Yud Aleph Halacha Aleph. This is on the bottom of page 2. And it's based on Gemara later on in the first parak of Al Basra. The Gemara says, Kol makom sheyesh bo asara. Whenever there are 10 people, Israel, tzarich lahachin lo bayis, you have to prepare an institution. She konsebo l'tefila b'koleis tefila. U'makom zeh nikra beis haknesses. The kofim b'nei ha'ir zeh zeh livnos beis haknesses. Liknos sefer Torah nevi'im u'ksuvim. This is not telling you how many Batei Knisios go down and so on and so forth. But what it is telling you is that building a shul, a proper shul, a dedicated shul, meaning not just, having a tent where you can meet, and do tefillah b'tzibur. Having a proper shul is a communal requirement. So it's very interesting that some Rishonim say you can even eat and drink and sleep in the shul, even though you're not allowed to, but he can do it l'shem tzorchei hatzibur. Some the Gemaras actually seem to say that the Zayin Tovei Ha'ir, like the 7 community elders who are the Parnasim who run the community, they're the ones who determine also the policy when it comes to the shul, selling the shul, whatever. What am I trying to say? There are institutions in Jewish life that are communal institutions, right? Whose very existence, symbolically and substantively, is impactful. And what I was saying before, even about the Pidyon Shvuyim part, the limit of Pidyon Shvuyim, it's like the community's home. It's not just a place where, you do this function, you do that function. All these functions are designed to be in the Mikdash Ma'at of the Beis HaKnesses, and they impart like a certain stature to the shul that transcends, the functions that you perform there. And therefore, there's one mandamar in the Gemara that says, mishum pshius, we're not going to take any risk about either downgrading, the profile of Batei Knesios in our communities, or even, temporarily of, being without, even if you have a place where the minyan can meet. So I think that's one perspective. The idea that the shul as a community halachic institution whose very presence is impactful, is kovei. But I think there's a second element too, and this is something I want to discuss a little bit more next week. And that is, it goes again to something that Jacob kind of asked me in the beginning of the year, and I said I would get back to it, so I'm trying to be true to my word. And that is, there is a prohibition of mechikas Hashem. You're not allowed to rub out the name of Hashem from the Shemos HaKadoshim. And that same prohibition of mechikas Hashem, the Torah says, Lo sasun kein lashir, mizbechosehem titotzun. You're supposed to destroy, idols and altars, for idols and so on and so forth. And then the Torah says, Lo sasun kein lashem elokechem. You don't do that to the Rabboni Shalom. So that's understood to mean there's an Isra of Mechikas Hashem. Shem Hashem has to be treated respectfully. You can't just erase it. The Shemos HaKadoshim, we're not going to get into details now, but also you're not allowed to dismantle at least parts of, if not the entirety of the Beis HaMikdash. It's the same Isra, very interesting. In other words, what the Rambam calls derech hashchasa, if you destructively dismantle or a piece of the Beis HaMikdash, it's the equivalent of Mechikas Hashem. Very interesting. So what's curious is that when the Rambam discusses this problem in Hilchos Yisodei Torah, in Hilchos Beis HaBechira, so he talks about the Beis HaMikdash. But in Sefer Mitzvos, he hints that maybe it applies to Mikdash Ma'at, a Beis Knesses, and a Beis Medrash as well. And in the what's called the Minyan HaKotzar, we'll see it next week, in the shorter Minyan Mitzvos of the Rambam, he says explicitly that dismantling a shul, especially B'derech Hashkasa, is a violation of Lo Sasim Kein L'Hashem Elokecha. So I think that might be the idea behind Pshiusa, this idea of Mikdash Ma'at and Lo Sasun. And then the various qualifications probably need to be explained the way we were explaining them before. And that is, as long as you see this as an independent act of destruction, no matter what your future plans are, because they might be disrupted and so on and so forth. So you have a problem. It's only if, there's structural urgency or objective urgency, or there are reasons to see this as a continuum, where the dismantling is just part of the building, so you're not really dismantling, you're fixing, or you're expanding, or even if you're replacing. But it has a whole, that's not Lo Sasim Kein L'Hashem Elokecha. That's not disrespectful. So I think that has a lot to do with this as well. So we'll discuss that. And then I want to discuss what's going on with this Pidyon Shvuyim issue as well. Okay, so we'll try to do all that if we can.
Shkach, Rabbi. Thank you so much.
Oh.
Thank you. Good night. Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you.
Good night.